Good afternoon and welcome to Change Management for Higher Education, Tips for Successfully Implementing Change. My name is Dr. Drumm McNaughton and I'll be giving the presentation today. When I first started developing this presentation, I thought about a title. What I really wanted to name it was something like this: What got you here won't get you where you want to go. How we implement change in the 21st century is far different than we did back in the 90s, where the Bible was John Cotter's Leading Change, which is a great book and will give you the basics on how to make change happen in organizations. But because of 5 generations in the workplace, because of a number of other things that have happened out there, including the reduced government funding of education, the dumbing down of America in some respects, the many different changes that have happened, implementing change isn't the same way as it used to do or used to be. You know, for instance, we just recently had the election, and democracy American style is far different than it used to be 4 years ago. It is not nearly as civilized, and there's far more use of the press than there was ever before. We're seeing changes all over the world as well with Brexit, you know, the British exit of the European Union. There's unlimited political funding due to the Citizens United decision at the Supreme Court. We've seen the middle class disappearing over the many years. One of the main reasons why Donald Trump was elected, if at least you listen to the pundits on the news and the radio. From an education perspective, the enrollment demographics are changing. We've got 5 generations in the workplace, which I mentioned earlier. Private universities are struggling. There's cuts in funding to the publics. We have competency-based education. We have MOOCs. There's all sorts of different things going on. And so the way we can implement change nowadays is far different than what it used to be before. My buddy Albert said, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Well, the challenge is going to be is if you do things over and over, you are going to get the same results because the world, the environment around you has changed. And one of the sayings in change management is once you push the go button, once you start the change, you can never back it out. It's never going to be the same as what you did before. So we've got to make sure we get it right from the get-go, and there's a lot of things that we do to make sure that that happens. Now, most planning starts, or most change starts with strategic planning. You know, let's get the direction of where we're going. The problem is planning only has one goal: developing the strategic plan and the document. What about implementation and change? This is why most organizations suffer from what we call spots: the strategic plan on the top shelf gathering dust. Most organizations, I'd say probably 90% of them, do not have separate plans for implementation and for change. Part of the reason why the failure rate for projects is 80% or north of that. So what we talk about is putting a strategic management system in place. Now you can see from the slide here, there's really 3 different levels of planning that you see. The first of these is what we call reactive. You know, it's the organization attempting to survive. You have doing an annual budget. You have financial objectives. The more traditional is you'll do annual planning. You'll do 3-year budget forecast. You may do a retreat, and your organization may have a vision, a mission, and a values. Where you start to get to being more proactive is by having each business unit have its own individual plan. You do true strategic planning, which goes across the entire organization, or that last is what we call 20th century holistic management systems, where you're doing all of the things in this and you're looking for both alignment of your organization, of the plan, of the processes, and attunement with the people, also known as shared vision. So this is what we call a 21st century holistic management system. We'll talk more about that in a few minutes. We do have 3 requirements of this holistic management system. The first of those is delivery alignment. It's planning and change, which are the primary job of leaders of an institution. Second is stakeholder attunement. People support what they help create. We've heard this over and over in our lives, but it's really true. It's people who will make or break an implementation. The last of these requirements, we think, is what we call holistic thinking, that leaders have got to focus on the big picture, and you have to strive for and measure your outcomes so that you know where you're going. Let's talk about these a little bit in more detail. The organization and delivery alignment. Most everyone has seen this product business cycle growth. It works for businesses. It works for universities as well. You start off at the beginning of a timeline with a concept creation, the concept development, you build the market for it, and then you optimize it. After a while in this harvesting stage, things tend to go down. Hence we go back to that first piece. Planning and change are the primary responsibility of senior leadership. You have to build in this second piece of it, which is reinventing the business. Now, when does this start? Does it start right here? No, it certainly doesn't. When you're developing your markets, you've got to be thinking of what that next step is. Hence, your curve continues to go up instead of going down in the harvesting over time. The second piece of this is that stakeholder attunement, people supporting what they help create. And to illustrate this, we've got a little bit of a story. For those of you who are familiar with downtown Los Angeles, this is the Westin Bonaventure Hotel. If you drive by at night, you'll see its iconic red, green, blue, and yellow elevators on the outside that illuminate the building. It's very, very beautiful. Well, there's a story about how this building was constructed. This part here where you see my cursor is the 4th floor, and it has outside places where you can eat. The food court is there. That's where the swimming pool is, etc. Well, as they're building the building, they started building it up, and the architect and the engineers and the builders were there, and the plans were rolled out. What had happened was they had not figured out how they were going to get people all the way up to the 4 towers. And there was one of the construction workers walking by, and he overheard their talking about the problem, and he looked down and he just kind of went, interesting. And they looked up at him and said, okay, what are you going to add to this? And they asked him, do you have any thoughts? What's the problem? And they talked about the elevators. And he thought about it for just a minute, and he said, why not put them on the outside? And now you know, as Paul Harvey said, and I'm dating myself on that one, the rest of the story. You have 4 elevators on the outside of the towers, 1 red, 1 green, 1 blue, and 1 yellow that light up the Los Angeles sky at night. People support what they help create. The last piece, requirements for doing strategic management for the 21st century, is the ability to think holistically. Thinking holistically is looking at the big picture, the ability to see the forest and the trees at the same time. And the way you do this is by focusing on outcomes. You have to serve the customer. But in education, that's not necessarily easy, because who is your customer? Most universities that I speak with will say the customer is the student. I would respectfully disagree. The student is only one of your customers. Your real customer is the business community or the employers. Universities are part of the talent supply chain. And in that talent supply chain, they need to prepare the students just like you would building a computer on a supply chain. You need to create the computer, you need to create the model, you need to move that down the assembly line so that when it leaves, it's ready to contribute to whatever it wants to do. So it is really preparing the student for them to be ready for business or wherever to be used. So a little bit different way of thinking of it, hence the government regulations on graduation rates and gainful employment. It's part of that thinking about focusing on outcomes. Now, complexity is the enemy of holistic thinking. And for those of you who know me, I used to fly airplanes for a living. And the first photo we have here is the cockpit of an F-15. It was designed back in the 1960s, and it was designed by engineers. You can see it's got a tremendous amount of technology in here, but it's all disparate. Here's your stick to control it. You've got your throttle over here on the left side. Can't really see it that well. You've got radar screens, your attitude gyro, altimeter, you know, all the different things that you need to fly an airplane. Well, that was designed by engineers, and you can see the complexity. Now we move to the 20th century, and we take a look at the F-35 cockpit, the newest airplane to hit the Navy and Marine Corps and the Air Force. This is looking down at the cockpit. You can see instead of the stick here, the control stick is right here. It's a little joystick, just like what you have with some of your gaming computers. You have your throttle over here. You have all of these gadgets, all of these screens, these indicators. They're all built into this one screen right here. And you've got toggle switches here that will allow you to toggle back and forth. This airplane was designed by pilots to make sure that they could handle the complex workload that it requires to fly an airplane at over 1,000 miles an hour close to the ground. The way to cure this type of thinking, this analytic thinking, is to keep the higher perspective and focus on your outcomes. Now, analytic thinking breaks things down into its smallest pieces and tries to solve problems. For some things, that works really well. For the most part, though, if you're focused on outcomes, you're looking at the big picture and you're measuring those outcomes. Bottom line, if you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. So let's get into the details of 21st century holistic management. Starting off with some of the keys to growth. And this is one of the reasons that we preach it's so important to have these type of things. Back a few years ago, the American Quality Foundation and Ernst & Young did a study looking at about 600 institutions and 945 different management practices that lead to higher performance in market performance, in productivity, and in financial performance. They found only 3 universally beneficial practices. First, strategic planning with good implementation practices. Business process improvement methods if they're focused on the customer. And lastly, the continuous broadening of breadth and depth of leadership and management practices. Only those 3 things. Now, yes, this was a study that was focused on for-profit businesses. However, these things, in my experience, go out over the entire range of industries, including higher education. So, planning and implementation, business process improvement if focused on the customer, and then continuous broadening the breadth and depth of leadership and management practices. three critical things. So the first one of these things that you have to do in putting in a strategic management system is you've got to chart your course. You've got to know where you're going. Just like one of my favorite movies and books, Lewis Carroll, Alice in Wonderland. Alice asked the cat, "Would you please tell me which way I ought to go from here?" asked Alice. "That depends a good deal on where you want to get," said the cat. "I don't much care where," said Alice. "Then it really doesn't matter which way you go." How many organizations, how many institutions do you know that are just like that? They don't have a solid plan that goes throughout the institution that charts the course on where they want to go. So what we do is we say you need to think holistically about strategic management. You have to be able to define your ideal future, your vision, your mission, and your values. You also need to talk about your future environment. Most institutions that I know of, they do a great job in looking at the current environment, but they don't take into account the future environment by prognosticating, by forecasting what the environment is going to be like as they move forward toward their ideal future vision. The positioning, the rallying cry, those are all things that organizations need to do. And positioning, especially for higher education, is a huge miss. 90% of all institutions look just like everybody else. They have an MBA, they have a doctorate of education, or they have undergraduates in psychology. You'll see a few who are positioned very, very well. For instance, Carnegie Mellon, very high up in artificial intelligence and in IT. They made a conscious decision many years ago to go down this path. The same with Johns Hopkins with respect to medical, or Harvard with respect to their MBA, and they're using their case-based methodology, which many organizations have adopted. Positioning is one of those critical things that universities need to do if they want to attract a better quality and more students. The next thing is you need to have feedback and measures. You know, how are you going to measure when you get to achieving what your vision is? What are the feedback mechanisms that you have built in? What are the metrics? Your current state assessment. You know, where are you right now? The common way of getting one of those is a SWOT. But there are other ways as well to do that. There's multiple ways. One of the things that's interesting is we preach starting with the end in mind, starting with the vision, mission, and values. And that way, once you have where you're going and you decide, you know, where you are, or you figure out where you are, then you develop your business plans, your strategies, and you set your priorities for going where you need to go. Then you set your annual plans and budgets, and then you do your implementation. You put your change structures in place. All of these require leadership, but one of the most important things in this whole thing is your stakeholder attunement process. That is the creating of the shared vision. We're going to talk a lot more about how to create that shared vision and get that attunement here in just a little bit. So with all these things, it requires an alignment of your org structures, of your plans, and your processes. Now, you should have an organization-wide strategic plan, you know, your vision, your mission, your values, and your measures. You're going to have different business units. You're going to have enrollment, you know, operations, financial services. You'll have academics. You'll have technology, all of these different units. And then you're going to have your support areas, HR, finance, legal, you know, marketing and sales, or recruiting. Enrollments. Now, what's the glue that holds all these things together? Those are the core strategies that you come up with as part of your strategic plan. So your core strategies come down to build your annual operating plans and your budgets, to set your performance and rewards management system, to really create what is that customer value, that positioning that you need. Or another way of looking at it, you have 4 different levels. You have a strategic plan of 5 to 10 years. You may have 3-year business plans. You'll have 10-month department plans, and that goes right down into your individual planning and goal setting. So this is how the whole thing integrates, and the key is to use those core strategies as the organizing principles at all the different levels of the organization. The other key piece of this is the attunement and how to create a shared vision. Now, most organizations, when they do strategic planning, they do what we call the D-cubed approach. They decide, they disseminate, and then they defend. It is a top-down planning. The way that you get shared vision and create an organization which is more fully engaged is by doing what we call an attunement process, or the strategic attunement process, SAP. In this, at each step, the planning committee will take what they have developed and put it out to the key stakeholders to get their feedback. And they start getting this attunement through the ongoing adjustments that are needed to be done. There's a lot of benefits to having this back and forth dialogue. One, it creates consensus around the plan, gets everybody on the same page. It also identifies and prioritizes your key initiatives. It strengthens the institution, its finances, and it can improve the allocation of resources, creating the shared vision. But really, the biggest thing that this does are 3 things. 1, creating shared vision. We've already talked about that. People support what they help create. They want input into decisions that will affect them before that decision is made. That is 1 that's critical. Second is it gets a plan that is really in touch with the people who are executing it. How many executives at an institution, organization, college, university do you know that knows everything that's going on in the front lines of that organization? I would go to say there are almost none of them unless that executive tends to micromanage everything, which they shouldn't be doing. So it gets the plan really in touch with what's going on the real world. Lastly, it helps mitigate and almost does away with all resistance to change of the implementation. You really have 4 different types of people when it goes to implementing a plan. You've got those who are going to jump at the chance of any kind of change. You're going to have those who are much more cautious, and they will go along once they get a sense of it. You're going to have what we call cynics, who are not going to accept anything new, and they just tell you it doesn't work, and they won't give you a good reason why. And lastly, you have skeptics. Skeptics are those people who will tell you this isn't going to work, and then they'll tell you why it isn't going to work. Skeptics are my best friend when it comes to developing a strategic plan, because they're going to tell me where all the potholes are and what needs to be done to make sure that we can implement them. And how many of us really want to have input into that plan that's going to affect us? We all do. And there's a tremendous pride that comes from seeing something in the plan that we said, I did that. That was my idea. So some of the benefits of stakeholder attunement is getting the best answers. This kind of creativity to get the best answers comes from this intense dialogue, this thought, these conversations with the stakeholder groups and the planning team. You know, sometimes it even results in a second or a third intense dialogue as you go along in the process at that next planning meeting. It also gives us the ability to test those assumptions to make sure that we are in fact addressing the current and future challenges and to really understand what's going on in the business and the university. We already talked about the buy-in, but it's critical. It's one of those things. So the next piece of this is, that is the planning process. The next piece of this is we're going to talk about how to implement the changes, or what are commonly referred to as a business process improvement. It is a given fact that 80% of all changes fail to realize their results. Unfortunately, we've all had change efforts like this surfer who's hitting the ground. It's not fun, and in fact, it goes up in smoke. The challenge is once you started the change, you can't back it out. So there's some critical things that have to be done as we move forward. Everybody thinks that change follows an orderly, rational process, that somebody else has it figured out and it'll be smooth sailing. Well, that's nothing close to the truth, because change is messy. We plan it out as best we can. Most people, frankly, don't plan it out. They just pull a trigger and go. But in planning it out, it never will go according to plan. There always has to be little tweaks as we go through. Here's the bottom line. Most organizations don't fail for lack of talent or strategic vision. They fail for lack of execution, that routine blocking and tackling that great organizations consistently do well and strive to do better. That's the critical thing, is it's step by step. Plan it out and make sure you do it. The big challenge comes down to, what is going to win out? Is it going to be the day-to-day stuff, what you currently do, or the change? We all know it's the day-to-day stuff that keeps the lights on, keep enrolling students, etc., instead of the change of doing things until you absolutely have to. The other thing with that is, work does not get done by a formal org chart. Work gets done by the informal org chart, the relationships that we have built up with people. And when you go to change an organization, Mary may have been responsible for taking care of ensuring all of the financial aid packages were done. But with the reorganization, it's now Jeremy. So when Joe needs to go to Mary, Mary doesn't do this, has to tell him to go over to Jeremy. It cuts down. Frankly, change, significant change, takes 18 months to 5 years to get back to the same level of productivity as prior to the change. And that only is if you do good change management in the process. Sometimes you will never get back. Here's a basic model of how change actually happens. You know, and this is from Kurt Lewin, one of the gurus of change management. You start off with the frozen piece here. You know, they're unaware of needing to change. You unfreeze the organization, creating the motivation to change. You start moving to that new stage, and then when you get there, you stabilize at the new level. The challenge is you hit this area right here where you need input into the organization as energy boosts to make sure that you can continue to get the new behaviors to continue. This may be putting things in place from a HR perspective on evaluations. It may be other things that you would do, celebrating small wins to keep the momentum going. But you've got to have this support put in there if you expect to keep people and get them to that new level of the organization. One of the ways you do this is through putting into place change structures. This is part of your change management plan. Your visionary leadership. When a change is announced, the CEO, the president of the university, the senior executives, all with their personal leadership plans, need to be out for the first 2 weeks talking about why the change is happening. What are the reasons behind it? They've got to have a clear message to communicate. Now, if you've done this as part of an attunement process, people already understand why they're doing this and will see the changes going into place. What this does is it ensures the fit and the integration of the parts and the people toward that shared vision. But this is a critical piece, and this is why the leadership of the organizations have to be involved in planning out the change. You need to have a project team. Somebody's got to be able to deal with the change process versus the day-to-day stuff. You need to have an executive committee who follows up on the 15 to 25 priority areas for this year's plan from the strategic plan. Now, when we do planning, we don't want any more than 5 to 7 core strategies, but there are other things that come underneath those strategies in the different business units. And so that's why we say the 15 to 25 priority yearly actions. You need your change leadership steering committee, which is the folks who the project actually reports up to make sure that everything is moving forward. They're the ones to take out the roadblocks that are necessary. Sometimes this change leadership steering committee is the same as your visionary leadership or your executive committee. Sometimes it isn't. It just depends on the size of your institution. And lastly, and this is absolutely critical in today's environment now where you have so many different IT changes that are going on, you need a program management office to make sure that all the IT changes are fitting together and they're not walking on each other. So you've got to put these change structures in place. Now, we would hope that changes look like this, one big change after another and fairly controlled, but we all know that change doesn't work this way. And so there's always resistance to change. And even if you do develop a shared vision, you're going to have resistance to change. Just like with an iceberg, any kind of organization output is what you see up at the top, the 10 to 13% that's available. The rest of the stuff is down below the surface. And that really is your patterns or your processes, your structures, and lastly, your mental models. If you really want to make a big change, you have to change people's mental models. A good example of this is faculty tenure. How do you change the model of faculty tenure? It's very, very difficult. You can change the structures, just like Scott Walker did in the state of Wisconsin. You can change the pattern and how tenure is granted. But until you change the mental model that tenure is really important to faculty, you will never get true change that is embraced by anyone. And without it being embraced, how do you get shared vision and how do you get the ability to implement change as it's needed? So really the bottom line is people choose to change or not to change based on their mental models and the trust that they have in their leadership. Or what it really boils down to is they don't get it, they don't like it, or they don't like you. That's all about what change is. Which brings us to the next part of it, the sustaining the progress, or what we call lead, follow, or get out of the way. One of my favorite cartoonists is Dilbert, Scott Adams. And this really totally sums up some of the leaders that I have unfortunately had in my career. Many of them are like the manager. Is your project plan done? I can't do a plan until you tell me the strategy. My strategy is to make you do a plan. Sometimes leadership just radiates from my body. Well, unfortunately, we all know leaders who are like this, and that's not what we need in these times where change is critical for the sustainability and the fact to the survival of many higher education institutions. Leaders need to understand the psychology of change. They need to understand that people support what they help create, but more importantly, they've got to be there for the people. The model of servant leadership is critical in today's institutions. They need to help people celebrate small wins. There needs to be HR initiatives behind rewarding people for new behaviors, and you've got to put those change structures in place. All of these things are critical for making sure that we can get the changes implemented that we need to in our institutions. It really boils down to my buddy Albert again. Everybody's a genius, but if you judge a fish on its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it's stupid. Or a nicer way of putting that is Jim Collins' Good to Great. You've got to have people on the right bus and in the right seat on the bus to make sure that you're successful. So let's put it all together. What is 21st century holistic management? And to do this, I'm going to show you a very busy diagram that talks about GE's strategic management process. Every year, starting in August and September, they start planning out their next year. They have an informal idea exchange in corporate and businesses. They have 35 business and senior corporate leaders meet in September at the headquarters. Then they have the corporate officers meeting in October. November, everyone comes together and they present the operating plans for the next year. In December, they start planning out the operating managers meeting in Boca Raton, where they have the 600 leaders from across the corporation come in and they launch initiatives. February, getting things moving in the business units. They come back in March, how are things going? They do the online CEO survey. You know, are they initiated yet? They're checking their customers. They're checking their employees. How are things going? Do they have the sufficient resources to execute? It's part of this cycle to where they're getting feedback to make sure that their plans get implemented. They continue on this, leadership performance reviews, going back to best practices, you know, July, checking the strategies, you know, the economic competitive environment, all of the things. This cycle goes every year. It's one of the reasons that GE executives are some of the most sought after executives in other areas of the country, in other industries, because they have this, no pun intended, drummed into them. They understand this process, and they take this and they go into other companies and implement it. This is the secret to GE success. And it can be the secret to your success in instituting change and building sustainable institutions going forward. Bottom line, we can't solve problems with the same level of thinking that created them. Our institutions are having challenges right now. And if we don't change how we approach those problems, we're not going to be able to solve them. So I want to thank you for your attention today. You've been a great audience, and we'll open it up for questions.